Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be planting the most bulbs I've ever planted in my container garden, and it also might be the last time I ever plant bulbs in my container garden. We'll see what happens this spring. So to understand why this might be my last attempt, let me take you back to 2 winters ago, or I guess 2 falls ago, when I first tried planting bulbs in my container garden. So I had just the front garden at the time. I got tulips, I think I got some daffodils and iris as well. And I planted tulip bulbs in my center raised bed and one of the slightly smaller raised beds. And then I think I planted all of the other bulbs in small pots. So pots that were probably all smaller than 12 inches in diameter. And I didn't do anything to them. I just left them outside as is. I had seen some people recommend covering them. And then I asked the garden center where I got some bulbs. They said probably not, and I figured the raised beds were large enough, so I probably didn't have to cover them. So I didn't do, again, anything except move the small pots into the corner with the rest of my perennials. That spring, so that was the spring of 2021, no, spring of 2022, and nothing came up in my small pots. So the irises, the daffodils, all of those rotted. But in my raised beds, I would say about 90% of the bulbs that I planted grew. So at the time, I thought maybe 2 different things. That 1, my raised beds were large enough that they had enough protection from the elements, didn't need to be covered. And 2, that maybe tulips just did a lot better at overwintering than other bulbs. But then I think I've learned that tulips are actually slightly less hardy than things like daffodils. But that was my thought at the time, that if I do tulips in my raised beds, they'll be fine and they'll come up. So let's do the math again on the years. Fall of 2022, I planted again tulips in my center raised bed. I also then had the raised beds on the back deck, so I planted more tulips there. And I planted tulips in small containers. And I think I had some daffodils in the raised beds back there as well, but I didn't do as many different varieties of flowers, just mostly tulips, a few daffodils. And in the raised beds, maybe 5% came up. Everything else rotted. So it must have either been a milder winter before or a less wet winter, although I think this past winter was pretty dry, but there must have been just a difference in the weather over winter. And almost all of my bulbs that were in my raised beds, again, uncovered, rotted. Now, the tulips that I planted in smaller pots, those I put in my greenhouse. So just a plastic greenhouse out on the back deck. So they had protection from moisture, a bit of protection from the cold, and those actually did sprout. So that's when I realized that I probably do need to cover my bulbs, even in large raised beds, and that whatever protection I can provide the bulbs in smaller pots will be good. Because the raised beds I obviously can't move, so the most that I can do, and I'll show you what I'm going to do after I get everything planted, is kind of tarp them and try to insulate them where they are. Whereas the pots I can at least pick up and carry and either take into the greenhouse or down to the garage for the winter. So that's going to be my attempt this year. I'm going to try to tarp my raised beds, I'm going to give a little bit more protection to the smaller pots, and fingers crossed, I have a great show of bulbs in the spring. If it doesn't work, then I'm not going to do bulbs anymore, because there's really no point in spending the money and the time and the effort planting all of them in the fall to have nothing happen in the spring except digging up a bunch of rotted bulbs. So what I will do, if I want to have spring flowers, and I did this in the beds this year, is just go to Home Depot in the spring and get pre-sprouted tulips and plant them. And then you don't have to worry about doing the overwintering process yourself, it's all done for you. So that'll be my plan. Now, because this might be the last time, I told myself I'm just going to plant bulbs in one bed on the back deck, and I'm going to plant fewer bulbs than I ever have before. But then I went to the stores and I got bulbs. I went to one store and got bulbs. I went to another store and got bulbs. I ordered bulbs online. So now I actually have more bulbs than I have ever planted. I am going to keep them all to the back deck though, just because in my garden, if I'm not planting, people with yards plant a lot more than I'm going to plant. So I'd rather have mine all together in one area, because that gives a better show than if I just had like some bulbs sporadically here, some bulbs over there. I'll be able to look out and see all my bulbs through this window. It has a church in the background. It's my favorite view from my rooftop decks. So that's gonna be the plan. What I'll do first is, we're inside right now because it's in the 40s Fahrenheit, which in the fall I'm freezing, but then in March when it's 40 degrees, I'm ready to go outside in shorts. So it's funny how your body kind of acclimates to the different temperatures throughout the year. So we'll go and plant everything outside in just a second, but I figured while we're inside, I will show you everything that I have and talk a bit about how I organize myself to get ready for planting. So I know you can't see it, but I have my bulbs all around me. I guess I'll start with, maybe I'll try to group them by category. So first off, something I've never grown in my garden before, I have 25 of these jumbo crocus bulbs. These will be one of the first flowering in the garden. I got these in person at a garden center, and that is what they're going to look like. I'm going to layer my planting so that I have, different bulbs coming up at different times throughout the spring, so that there's not really a time when the beds are empty. Again, fingers crossed. Next, I have daffodils. Now, for some reason, I went to a garden center and just got 4 at first, which maybe I thought I would only do 1 pot of them. And then I went to another garden center and I got a bag of 20 of these daffodils. So this one is Dutch Master, 20 of the Dutch Master, and then 4 of the King Alfred. I don't know, let me see if there's a difference in height on these. These are 14 to 16 inches. These are also 14 to 16 inches. So I don't think you'll be able to tell if I just plant all 24 together in one bed that there is a big difference between those. So those are all of the daffodils. Then let's go with this bag down here, because I think there's also some early blooming plants. I got 2 different types of muscari. I got muscari armeniacum. We just learned about this in my horticulture class. So this is the variety that we learned about. These are kind of like just the traditional muscari or the grape hyacinths that people think of. So it's that really pretty deep blue color. These are going to be kind of mid-spring. So I think after the crocus, along the same time as I almost said dahlias, the daffodils. And then I got muscari peppermint, which is kind of this light blue fades to white bloom. So I think that will be really pretty. And they only get, they're small, only 4 to 8 inches tall. So put these over here. So I have total 50 of the muscaris. From the same place where I got just 4 daffodils, I got just 6 alliums. I love the idea of having all my back raised beds filled with alliums. I think that would look really pretty, but since I only have 6 of these, I think I'm going to put them into individual pots. So maybe 3 in one pot, 3 in another pot, and again, give those a little bit more protection over winter, because I just don't think 6 is enough to put together in one raised bed. So these will likely be for pots, and I have a whole Excel file I'll show you in just a second to help me figure out where things are going. Oh, I was going to say everything else is tulips, but they're not. So these are the last ones that I picked up at, again, another garden center. So is it Chionodoxa? Please forgive me for my pronunciation of that. I've never grown these before, but these are Violet Beauty. And these, when do these bloom? These will bloom March and April, so on the earlier side. And again, these are not very tall. These are going to get 4 to 6 inches tall. So I have, again, Violet Beauty, and then, is it Chionodoxa? And then Blue Giant, which even though these say the word giant, how tall are these going to get? These are going to get 6 to 8 inches tall. So these, I'm pretty sure also, yes, early spring. So these, along with the crocus, will be some of the earliest to come up. I have 25 of this one. How much is this one? 15. So I have 40 total. Now everything else that I have are tulips. And this one's a little bit different. These are like wildflower tulips or wild tulips. So these are actually going to be early spring as well. They're also super short, like 4 to 6 inches. This is what they look like. They're deer resistant, but again, if a deer ever gets up to my rooftop deck, I will gladly give them whatever they want because there's no stairs to access them from the outside. So I have 35 of these, and then I have what I guess would be the more traditional tulips. I have 10 of the Queen of Night, which peach. These are a really, really pretty, like deep purpley color. I'm really excited for these, although I'm trying not to get myself too excited just because I don't know if they're actually going to successfully overwinter. But then I have 7 of the silver parrot design tulips. These are really pretty. These have variegated leaves that look similar to another variety I got online. But these are going to be like the traditional, again, tulips blooming in the later spring. So 7 of those. I didn't do any sort of like color scheme. I just grabbed whatever looked pretty, which is basically my garden. And then I have 8 of these yellow pomponette tulips. So these have kind of like the extra frilly look to them that I think are really pretty. Again, 8 of these. And then everything else that I have, I got online. And there's no pictures on the bag, so I'll insert a picture here somewhere so you can see what they look like. But in this box here, I have 10 of the La Belle Epoque tulips. I can't even remember what these look like off the top of my head. This one is the one, though, that also has variegated leaves. I saw these growing in someone's parkway, snapped a photo, and looked up the variety, but it's 25 of the Chinatown tulips. So I'm really hoping those work out. Then I have 10, again, of the Renown Unique tulips. And last in here are 10 of the strawberry cream, which is also, I mean, they're all really pretty, or I wouldn't have gotten them, but I remember specifically what this one looks like as well. So that's everything that I have to plant. Let me, before we go outside, talk a little bit about the Excel file, because I use Excel to plan, well, my whole life, but also the garden. And I will pop an image up of what my Excel file looks like, just so you can see what I'm talking about. It's nothing mind-blowing, it's just the information that, again, helps me plan my garden. So that's all for inside. Let's go ahead, we'll head outside. I think I'm actually gonna lay out all the bulbs about where they're going to go, and then we will start planting. Here is where the bulbs are gonna go, in these 3 raised beds, and then a few are gonna go in those gray pots. I think I'm just gonna do raised beds today, because I got a little bit later start than I wanted to, and we don't have as much sunlight anymore. But this is gonna be the background in the spring. Obviously there's some fall color right now, but I am imagining that I will have, fingers crossed, a beautiful rainbow of bulbs with this in the background come spring. So let me show you what I've organized. The center bed is going to be planted in its own way. So in here for the earlier blooms, I have all 25 of the crocus are going to go in here, all 25 of the Muscari armeniacum, and then the 20 of these daffodils. Then I also have here the strawberry cream and the Chinatown, but I'm going to take 10 of the Chinatown tulips out of the 25 that I have and split them between the other beds. So each bed on the side is going to be planted in the same way, and I'm going to divide up all of these between each. Now some of them are odd numbers, so that'll be a little bit of a challenge, but all of the Muscari peppermint, the wild tulips, I Googled this, and of course everything I click on pronounces it a different way, but Chionodoxa is what I'm going to go with. So these I'm each going to split in half. Same thing with these bulbs, so the La Belle Epoque, and what was this? The Renown Unique, and then the yellow pomponette and the Queen of the Night. So we'll kind of see how that goes. I just didn't feel like I had enough of 2 different kinds to all mix them together, but I don't know, maybe I would do just like this and this together so I don't just have 4 yellow. You know what, I might still think about the tulips here. But for now, since I know my center bed is ready to go, I'm going to plant that one up first. Now what I've done already is obviously pull all of the annuals that were in here. I did go ahead and add some perlite to help with drainage, because that's been an issue in the past, is my tulip bulbs staying too wet. And I added in some compost just to refresh the beds. I also have bulb tone that I will add into the holes. So we'll plant this one first, starting with the bulbs that need to be the deepest, which are the tulips and the daffodils, and then I will add the hyacinth and the crocus on top. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is take all my tulips, because again they'll be blooming around the same time, and lay them out in the pattern that I want. I want to mix because I think this one, so the strawberry cream are 18 to 24. Chinatown is 20 inches to 24. So they're all about the same height. So I don't need to, in this case, worry about height of the different varieties. So I'm just going to mix them all through, but I don't want like one chunk of one and then one chunk of the other. And then I will put in the daffodils, which again should come up before, although last year was a weird year for daffodils. I feel like they came up late. They should come up before the tulips, and then we'll get those planted because those are all about 5 to 6 inches in depth. And then we will mix together the hyacinth and the jumbo crocus. So let's start with Chinatown. I did, like I said, take out 10 of these, which are going to be in the side beds. So then I have, did I have 20 or 25? I had 25, so I have 15 of these left. So again, I just want them scattered. And when you are planting a bulb, you want to have the pointy side up. So typically it'll be easy to tell. Sometimes it's not. I'll see if I have any that are a little bit harder to tell. But if you ever can't see roots or a point, then err on the side of on the side so it can find its way up if it needs to. But for the most part, I feel like the bulbs I'm planting are pretty easy to tell. So point up, root side down. So I don't want this to be like, I don't know, a perfect arrangement. I do kind of like it when the bulbs look just a bit more wild and strewn about. All right, so then I have 20 of the strawberry cream. And these are both pinky color, so I think they'll look really nice together. So there's 10 in this bag. Again, just kind of going, let's move you over here, in between where I have the other ones. And I don't care about the mess, like the skins of the bulbs getting in here, because those will break down over winter. And also, when you are layering bulbs like this, you don't have to worry too much about, for example, like making sure the muscari is not right on top of a tulip, because they'll grow around. They're very good at finding their light. Now the daffodils, because again, all about the same depth. So I'm just going to lay these out in here too. So with this will be the only bed with daffodils in it. I do have daffodils that'll be in a pot. Those extra 4, I'm just going to do it together in a pot, but I don't know. I think it'll be pretty still. Now, I will say also, no, I think I like it like that. I go closer together in both raised beds and pots because these aren't going to stay here. In fact, they would rot if I left them in the bed because I give my annuals so much water in the summer. So these will get dug up. I will either treat them just as annuals, or if they do well, I like to move them down to the parkway, especially the daffodils, because those tend to naturalize and come back better compared to tulips. But I have had the tulips come back. And here we go. These are all of the 5 to 6 inch deep bulbs. Now, what I brought out, I need to grab my gloves too, is my Hori Hori knife, because this goes 6 inches deep. So if I stick it in, I know about how far down to go. Now, part of me was thinking, remove 6 inches of soil, lay everything down, and then cover it, but that's too much work. I'd have to put it in a pot somewhere and then dump it back on. So I want to go about 6 inches deep. That's how deep that will be. And I'll just stick the bulb down in there and cover it up. I do feel like a Hori Hori knife has really helped. Like I said, didn't really have a lot of tools before, and I still don't need a ton, but the Hori Hori knife itself is really good, especially for the measurements. All the 6 inch bulbs are planted. Now we'll do the 3 inch bulbs. And again, I'll do the same thing. I'll just lay them out on top and then we will plant them. And again, these are all around the same height, so I'm not going to worry too much about front or back. In fact, if I'm going to mix so many things together, I might not worry about that as much. So that's the muscari placed. Now I'll place all the crocus. I kind of want to, I don't know if it's crocuses, but I have the urge to say croci for the plural, but I'm sure it's crocuses. All right, so now it's time to start planting. For this one, we're only going 3 inches deep, so I'm just going to push them in with my hand because I feel like my finger depth is about 3 inches. And we'll get these planted, and then we'll be done with this bed. Bed is complete. So now I'll move on to splitting the bulbs, mixing them around for the other 2 beds, getting them planted. It's going to be the same process, so I don't want to bore you too much with just watching me put bulbs in the ground. So we'll speed through that. Then we'll talk about how I'm going to try to make sure they survive this winter. Everything is now planted, and that didn't take too long, maybe, I don't know, 30 minutes total to get them all in there. I did add a little bit of compost on the top too, just because I had it on the deck and I wanted to empty out the bag. So here are the beds planted. Planting bulbs is always interesting because you do all the work and you don't see anything from the work until hopefully a few months later. So now let me talk a little bit about my overwintering plans for these raised beds. All right, everything is planted, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues or the reasons behind the issues I've had with my bulbs rotting over winter, and then some of the things I'm going to do to try to prevent it. And this is all going to depend on your specific growing environment, your zone, how wet or dry your winters get. So at least keep that in mind. I'm talking about my experience in winter, specifically here in Chicago. So first off, if the soil stays too wet, so if you have a lot of rain or a lot of snow over the winter time, that can keep the bulbs too wet. And I think that's been the main culprit behind my bulbs not doing too well, because just like with root rot, if your soil is too wet, then the bulbs don't have enough oxygen, they're going to rot and not produce any flowers in the springtime, which is sad. So moisture is one thing. Also, the cold. So even though bulbs need chill hours, which I have that video on chill hour temperatures that I'll link down below, they don't like to be too cold. And hardiness can even vary per bulb. I think, like, for example, daffodils are more hardy than, let's say, a muscari. So with the cold, the bulbs are growing. They're growing over the fall and over the winter, producing roots in order to actually break through the soil and bloom in the springtime. And when you're planting in the ground, even if the temperature gets freezing, the ground isn't going to freeze as quickly as the air temperature. I think it's about reading 10 to 20 degrees warmer in the ground, just a few inches where you're planting the bulbs, versus in containers where that soil can get to the same temperature as the air temperature. And if it stays frozen too long, then that can inhibit the bulb. It won't grow and that'll die. And then also, freezing and thawing can be problems for bulbs. So it will start to grow because it'll get really warm, and then it'll get really cold, so then the bulbs will die that way. So there's a few different things that can kill your bulbs over winter. So if you are going to overwinter them outside, like for example, my raised beds I can't move, it's recommended, and this is true for all plants that you're going to overwinter outside, it's recommended to move them to a shady spot, which is different than what I thought before I really started gardening. I assumed that plants would like more sun in the winter time. But if you're growing in containers, that thawing and then freezing and thawing and then freezing over winter time, if they are in the sun, especially because not only does potting soil or pots of soil cool down faster with the air temperature, it also heats up faster. So if the sun is shining on it, it can make the container and the bulbs inside the container think it's warmer than it actually is outside, so they'll start to grow. So moving plants to a shady spot is what you want to do so there isn't as much of a risk of that thaw and freeze pattern. Now my raised beds, I can't move. So they're going to sit right there. The shadiest, they're all going to get sun. The shadiest one is looking at him, the one on the right-hand side. So I can't really do much about that. But what I am going to try to control for is the moisture. And I don't know if I'm going to tarp it right now. I will bring the tarp up here so I can show it to you. But we are still looking at a few days without rain, and my soil in there is already wet. So another thing too is when you plant bulbs, you're then supposed to water them in, but because it just rained yesterday, I am not going to water them in because the soil is already damp enough. Again, I'm trying to avoid overwatering my bulbs. So my plan is for the winter, tarp them, let them be, kind of forget about them, and cross my fingers and hope that they come back next year. Now, I can't say whether this method works or not because I haven't tried it yet. The only thing I can say for sure that worked last year with my tulips in the smaller pots was putting them in the plastic greenhouse, which was in the most shaded corner. I didn't water them except for when I planted them because the soil in the pots was dry. I left them in there and they sprouted just fine. So that at least worked for me. I am going to keep more in the garage this year because that's even more protection. Our garage stays at about 40 degrees, which is in that chill requirement range. But the raised beds I really can't do much about except the tarp. So let me take you back outside. I'll show you the tarp, and I actually need to see if it's going to cover all 3 beds as is or if I'm going to have to cut it up. And if so, like I said, I'm going to do that at a later day because we are still in like the 40s and 50s and it doesn't look like we're having any rain in the forecast. So anyway, let me show you the tarp. So this is the tarp. It is long enough, it looks like, to cover the raised beds, which is what I wasn't sure about. Now, obviously it's a square, so it's much longer, but I'll probably just fold it in half, and then I'm going to use pots on the bottom to keep it down. I'm thinking I also might like scooch the raised beds back and tuck the tarp behind it, because the main thing with the tarp is that it can blow around in the wind. I actually used this last year on my flower cart out front, and it just acted like a sail and kind of rolled around the deck over the winter. So I'm not going to tarp that this year, but I think if I weigh this down enough, that should be fine. I'm contemplating just putting things directly on top of here, but I want to make sure I don't forget to check in the spring, not that I think I will, for the bulbs coming up, because I don't want them to try to come up and then there's something sitting on top of them. And maybe I'll just do that through the winter and then like put a reminder in my calendar early spring or late winter to check. But I don't know if I'm going to tarp them quite yet because there are still some things I need to move around. It's, like I said, not supposed to rain, at least for a few days. So I think now that I know it works, I'm just going to leave them uncovered for now and then tarp them again, like I said, in a few days. And I'll show you what that looks like when I go ahead and do that. But I think that's going to be everything for today. So I have, well, not all my bulbs planted. I still have a few that I'm going to do in the gray pots. And then those I think I'm going to store in the garage. I actually don't know. I'm going to see once I get everything kind of gathered that I need to overwinter. I think most is going to go in the garage. And I don't know if I'm going to have to set up my greenhouse. Mostly because I can still carry some of my smaller perennials downstairs. Eventually they're going to get too big for me to do that. But yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have to. So we'll kind of see how that goes. But it might be an interesting winter. So yeah, that's going to be everything. Let me know what you do with your bulbs over winter. And again, just know that what I am doing in my process is very specific to my growing environment. So I will see you in the next video.